back again with a few more thoughts about melodrama. We probably have touched on blackface minstrelsy a little bit more than we actually have melodrama. So I'm probably going to spend a few extra minutes on this very, very influential dramatic form. Now, if blackface minstrelsy was one of the most popular theatrical forms in America, melodrama was even more popular. It was the bread and butter of the theater during the 19th century, especially in America. Now, were people still going to see variety acts? Yes. Were they still going to see Shakespeare? Yes, absolutely. But in terms of the most attended type of theatrical event, melodrama does win out even over blackface minstrelsy. Now, that is one reason why it's important, of course, but you might remember the lowbrow attitude that some people have toward popular theater forms. If it's popular, that somehow means that it's less intelligent or less worthy of study. Well, perhaps we can tease out some of the additional influences of melodrama and build a little bit more on what the textbook has to say about it. So, let's begin in a rather roundabout way with a discussion of what melodrama actually did making use of the theater space. Melodramas were an opportunity for a great deal of innovation in scenic design, in taking risks on stage, and in designing architectural devices that could work well in a very sort of a dramatic, escapist sort of plot. So we'll talk a little bit about those, and then we'll go back and talk a little bit about what the form contained in the plays that were written down. And we'll also talk a little bit about the cultural context. So there was a lot of scenic innovation and growth in melodrama. And if the stories were on a grand scale and were that the writers were asking for a lot of exciting things to happen on stage, then somebody had to figure out how that was going to happen. Say, for example, that a building needed to burn down on stage, as in the play called The Poor of New York, which was a very popular melodrama in the middle of the 1800s. Or say that you were out in the Wild West in your melodrama and there had to be a fight between cowboys and Indians, or there had to be, a damsel in distress running away on a horse, in which also was an event in a famous American melodrama. Those sorts of things called for a lot of scenic innovation. Since producers also wanted to keep melodrama very tight so it could be suspenseful, there were innovations in how the sets were changed, how spaces were used. There were some very early hydraulic systems that were developed. There was an American producer named Steele Mackay that was particularly interested in that sort of thing. And the actor-manager Edwin Booth, who is one of the people that we will discuss later, was also responsible for bringing funding and belief in strong scenic elements for his productions into the expectations of the American theater. So basically, if you could dream it, somebody in the 19th century was probably trying to figure out how to put it on stage. So let's talk a little bit more about the form of melodrama, and we will also later discuss a well-made play. And those two are sort of related in my mind, because one of the key characteristics of melodrama is that the action needs to stay suspenseful and it needs to stay tight. And so what that means is that the cause and effect of moment to moment in the development of the plot of the melodrama is very carefully constructed. It's carefully put together, which is one of the main characteristics of a well-made play. That cause and effect, that fit, that good fit of all of the puzzle pieces. So tight, suspenseful action was a key characteristic of melodramas. Another characteristic that we have discussed some in our class is the inclusion of stock characters. Now, these stock characters were widely varied. There were all kinds of great stock characters in melodrama, even though you could probably boil things down into a more limited list, like the hero, the villain, and the damsel in distress, for example. But those characters were, again, intended to be perceived by the audience as fun and very much connected to the need to tell an entertaining story in a particular way. So in that way, stock characters was a key part of melodrama, whether you look at the characters as being defined very broadly, or whether you look at really specific character types and you realize just how many recognizable types there were in culture at this time. Now, so far I've been talking about melodrama in very much in a sense of an American form. And your book tells you that melodrama actually developed in France and it was popular in many other parts of the world besides America in the 1800s. But let's focus a little bit more on America when we look at some of the cultural significance of melodrama, particularly for the audience, even though the audience actually largely viewed it as an escapist afternoon at the theater. In fact, there was a big social conversation going on in a lot of melodramatic plays. There were even, you could even see particular types or categories of melodrama. For example, the stage versions, and there were several, of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe was an incredibly popular play throughout the middle and later 1800s. It toured the country I don't know how many times. And it was a very gripping story. But it was one of many melodramas that staged a conversation about race in America, or even more, a conversation about the abolitionist movement in America. So perhaps a scholar could say, well, there was a strain of melodramas that we could refer to as abolitionist dramas, which told the stories of people who were trying to help free African Americans from the bonds of slavery. Again, please note, though, that this is largely from the white perspective, and African Americans were still not really invited to the party, as we can now see with the benefit of hindsight. Let's look at another social movement, just as an example of a small strain of melodramas. You may remember reading about the temperance movement in the 1800s and the 1900s in this country. And that was a move against alcohol and a desire to prohibit alcohol, which, as you know, resulted in the enactment and then the repeal of the prohibition. But there were a group of people, a segment of society, who believed very strongly in the temperance movement, who believed in abolishing alcohol, just as the abolitionists believed in abolishing slavery. Alcohol was a social ill, and so a lot of domestic melodramas, sorts of family dramas, would deal with subjects like alcoholism. You would have sickness, right? You would have the alcoholic father who ran off on the mother that has tuberculosis, that is trying to raise her poor children and doesn't have enough to eat. And then the villainous landlord comes and demands the rent from her, which she cannot pay. And then, a hero comes in to save her. And somewhere along the way, the alcoholic father would show up, and through some revelation would promise to redeem himself, right? So there were abolitionist and temperance dramas even. Now, as I said, melodramas engaged a whole lot of different subjects that the 19th century American mind was captivated by. Things like the Wild West, and what was happening to the Indians. Things like big cities and the class divisions between the wealthy and the poor. Things like national identity and the clash or tension between perhaps American pride and foreign interests, especially the British interest, like we have talked about in class before. So there were lots of different ways that, even though an audience member could contentedly go to a melodrama and be entertained, there was still a lot of ways that it exerted cultural influence. Which reminds me of one last comment that I'd like to make about the form of melodramas. Now, one important part of the form of melodramas was that, in spite of all the suspense and perhaps a good deal of danger stirred in, there was usually a happy ending. And part of that happy ending included justice. In other words, the bad guy got what was coming to him, and the good people were able to win out, and that was part of what was considered a happy ending. But also, if we look at these sort of happy endings in melodrama, there tend to be a lot of revelations that lead to said happy endings. And there would perhaps be a device of some sort, either a literary device or an actual physical prop on stage, that would lead to some sort of happy revelation that would propel the play toward its climax and toward its happy ending. That is another characteristic that melodrama shares with a well-made play: the inclusion of some sort of device that brings about the resolution of the dramatic action. A lot of times in well-made plays, those devices tend to be letters or some sort of papers or documents that restore someone's integrity, or perhaps reveal that there's a family relationship that exists that nobody realized, right? And so, going back to our temperance drama example, what if the hero who thought he was a stranger, it turns out that he is the father's long-lost brother. And now that the alcoholic father has been reunited with his long-lost brother, perhaps he has a stronger motivation to kick that bad habit and be a good father to his children and so forth, and all of the things that the largely middle-class melodrama audience would have cheered for and felt satisfied in experiencing at the end of their play. So, the last thing I want to say about melodrama, and this probably is really the last thing, that is that most of our popular films today are still melodramas. They tend to be 3 acts. They tend to feature a lot of carefully crafted plot construction. They tend to have characteristics of the well-made play. They tend to feature a battle of good versus evil. Still, a lot of times there's good versus evil. And a lot of times the ending is happy, or at least promising. And so I would argue that not only were melodramas most popular in the past in America, but they still are today.